In the early 2000s, Cheryl McEwan wrote that since the ending of apartheid, the state, political parties, civil society and ordinary people in South Africa have attempted to deal with the traumatic legacies of the past to engender a common sense of nationhood. She highlighted, though, that the process of dealing with the past through the theoretical lens of post-colonialism, focusing in particular on attempts to establish historical truth and collective memory for black women who have often been most marginalised by colonialism and apartheid and excluded from dominant accounts of history. As we go towards another Women's Day, we look at the erasure of black women and their role in the era of apartheid. We're joined by Zubeida Jaffer, who is a South African journalist, author and an activist. So we're also joined by Natasha Allie, who's an acting CEO of the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. A very good evening to you both. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
I want to start with this quote. So most people have a problem with the idea that black women write. So these are the words of writer and activist Loretta Ngobo, reflecting on the legacy of black women writers in South Africa. The tradition of erasure, we're told, can be seen as early as 1937 in a book titled Gold Coast Men of Affairs, written by Magnus Sampson. The text does not include the names of women who participated in the nationalist history of the region. Let's start by defining the contemporary examples here in South Africa. Zubeida, let me start with you. Zubeida, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. What's your question?
So I was saying, can we start with contemporary examples of how black women or women in general have been written out of the history books, have been written out of the system of democracy in South Africa?
Yes, you know, Tepiso, in the 80s, I remember so clearly that there were 30,000 people detained and held for close to 3 years in detention. And when the negotiations started, many of these people were released. And then there was no kind of recognition that during that period, from the 87 to 1990, that the fort was held mainly by women. And the resistance was organized by women, because then the men came back, the men came and were around and they took center stage largely, not saying only, but largely. So that was the one example. And then, of course, I've been fortunate to write Mom Charlotte's story. She's our first female graduate. And she really kind of crafted the path for women's equality, women's participation in politics in the national life. But she was erased from history. So much so that not 4 years ago, longer than that, in 2012, when I started this work, I didn't even really know much about her. I knew very little about her, as most of us.
Natasha, I want to talk about, for instance, the 1976 Soweto uprisings, just in terms of building a post-colonial archive. Some would say there has been a subtle projection of that event prior and post that as being the initiative of young black men, even in pictures even. So what should be our first step in correcting some of this, and why do we continue to perpetuate this?
You know, there seems to be a hierarchy when it comes to the contributions of people to the liberation of this country. And I think it's because history is written by men, largely by white men, but let's say in this country, black men. And there's a great quote by Simone de Beauvoir where she says that representation of the world, like the world itself, is the work of men. They describe it from their point of view, which they confuse with the absolute truth. And I think that's what's happened in this country. You know, we don't tell the stories of women, and they get relegated to the annals of history, if at all. But I think we forget that without women, there wouldn't be a South Africa to have been liberated. And I think we have to tell the stories of women, and especially Black women, because it is that makes the absolute truth in the retelling of history. It is not the truth without the telling of women's stories.
Zubeida, is it the epistemic violence against Black women that is largely responsible for the continuation thereof? And can we illustrate how, at the moment, while we're talking about how women are disadvantaged, they are still denied a presence and the agency in the construction of the collective memory?
My sense is that it is changing, but it's very slow. If you look at Eleanor Sisulu, what she's written, if you look at even the story of Nokotule Dube, if you look at the story of Adelaide Tambo, if you look at all these stories, they are surfacing far more constantly than before. So I think that it's been slow, but it's not been absent. And especially in the last, you could say, 10 years, more and more women have come forward to write about other women.
And Natasha, I suppose that is also important. We were speaking earlier on about the proposed name change from Bramford to Winnie Mandela, and we were speaking also about in mediating this process of nation building. People like former President Thabo Mbeki unveiled in 2000 the Women's Monument at Union Buildings in Pretoria. Some would say it's a good start, but why is it that we still don't know the names of many women who were part and parcel of the struggle? Some of them are still alive, and we still only remember the names of women who are there, who are recorded. What are we doing I still ask this question, what are we doing in this exclusionary practice? I
think there are things that we should be doing that we aren't doing, like, promoting and really supporting women-led projects, celebrating the achievements of women. I think there needs to be a lot of structural change that occurs in terms of policy, the law, etc., that happens so that women's contributions are acknowledged. But I think it needs to be in a supportive environment. If we don't have women leaders, we are the ones who champion women's stories. It's just a fact of the matter. But if we don't have women leaders, we can't have change that promotes gender equality, because we have to be the ones to fight for that. We can't rely on men necessarily solely to fight for it. Even though it is the job of all genders, we can't only rely on men for that to be done. So I think to have women leaders who then champion structural and political change is very important in changing the narrative and in acknowledging the different contributions. If you have educational changes and the way history is taught, then you will know more about the different women that, even just the women who contributed and led to the 9th of August 1956 march. We know about Rahima Musa, we know about Lillian Ngoyi and Sophie de Bruyn, and we know about Helen Joseph. But there were 20,000 women, some women being the only woman from their village, their town, their city to come to Pretoria, to the Union Buildings. But why are these stories not being passed down? Why do we not know about the other stories?
All right, so we'll continue our discussion on this. How do we construct a national memory archive, and we'll look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the role that it's played, and the leadership that we need to ensure that women are at the forefront of recognition of where South Africa is in its transformative agenda.